The morning Harlan Briggs decided Clara Whitmore had finally lost her mind, she was standing on a wooden crate outside the north wall of her cabin with a hammer in one hand and a six-penny nail between her teeth, pressing a rough-cut pine plank flush against the logs with her forearm while she drove the first nail home. It was the third week of September, 1871. The light came sideways through the gap in the ridge, pale and thin, and it caught the resin bleeding from the fresh-cut wood and made it gleam like amber. Owen, 12 years old and already carrying himself with the deliberateness of someone who had been forced to grow a size too fast, worked the other end of the plank with his shoulder pressed hard against the wood. Seth 10 dragged boards from the mule cart in pairs, each one longer than he was tall, the weight of them leaving long grooves in the dirt behind him. Neither boy made a sound that wasn't necessary. Harlan Briggs stood on the eastern rise with a jug of corn whiskey hanging from 2 fingers and 3 men at his back who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday than watch a woman make a mistake. He let a silence bill the way men like him always do, the kind of silence designed to be filled by whoever feels most uncomfortable, before he said it loud enough to carry down the slope. This is what happens when you leave a woman alone too long. He took a pull from the jug and squinted against the light. She starts boarding herself in. Clara drove the second nail, then the third. The plank held. She didn't look up. She didn't shift her weight or pause or acknowledge in any visible way that sound had reached her ears, and that refusal, not dramatic, not pointed, just entirely absent of the response he was fishing for, was somehow more final than if she'd turned around and thrown the hammer at him. The men laughed. Harlan laughed. But he watched her longer than the others did, and his eyes, when he finally turned away, were not entirely amused. What Clara was building those first weeks of September didn't look like anything the valley had a word for. It wasn't a barn addition. It wasn't a porch, though it wrapped the cabin on the north and west faces the way a porch might. It was a second skin, a lean outer room of rough-cut pine set 18 inches away from the original log walls. The gap between them left open to purpose, the new roof angled outward at 15 degrees so that snow would shed away from the structure rather than accumulate along the joint. The original cabin, built by Henry Whitmore in the spring of 1866, when the land along Granger Creek was still cheap enough for a man with modest savings and a strong back to claim 40 acres without ruining himself, sat at the center of the emerging structure like a seed inside a husk. Nobody in the valley had seen anything like it, and because people tend to fear most the things they can't immediately name, they called it madness and let that stand. But Clara had been thinking about this for 2 winters. She had measured it in her head 100 times, lying awake in the narrow cabin bed that still felt too wide even after 2 years, listening to the wind work its way through the log joints and feeling the cold press in through the walls, the way water presses through cracked stone, patient, indifferent, certain of its eventual success. She had thought about the physics of it the way a person thinks through a problem they can't afford to get wrong. 2 walls meant a pocket of trapped air between them. Trapped air moved less. Air that moved less carried less cold. It was not complicated. It only looked complicated from the outside. She had not, in those 2 winters, explained this to anyone. There was no one to explain it to, and even if there had been, she was not certain the explanation would have survived contact with the kind of thinking that lived in the valley. The assumption that things had always been done a certain way because that way was correct, not merely because it was familiar. The materials were the first problem anyone might have pointed to as evidence against her. A widow with 2 boys, $14 in a tin box, a Mueller stove that smoked predictably, and no income beyond what she could earn with her hands. What was she building with exactly? This was the question the valley held behind its teeth for the first 2 weeks, too busy watching to ask directly. The answer was 3 summers of careful exchange. Since Henry died in the winter of 1869, Clara had worked with the patience of someone who understood that money was only one form of currency. All through the summer of 1871, she had washed and ironed for 4 households in the valley: the Briggs family, the Dwyers, the Petersons, who ran the sawmill, and the Coles family, where the Reverend's wife was perpetually behind on everything domestic because she was also perpetually pregnant. Clara took no coin from Peterson. Instead, she had arranged over a conversation at the trading post in June that lasted less than 4 minutes to collect his mill offcuts, the rough-cut pine boards that were too narrow or too short for building contracts, but perfectly adequate for enclosing an existing structure. She made 3 trips a week through July, with the mule cart stacking the boards in the woodlot behind the cabin, letting them air dry through the hottest part of the summer. From the Dwyers, she had accepted burlap sacks, 4 dozen of them used for grain, and cleaned out in exchange for making 3 sets of winter clothes for the children in the family, which she sewed at night after Owen and Seth were asleep, the lamp turned down low to save oil. From the Reverend's wife, she accepted wool batting, the remnants of a quilting project that had never been finished, in exchange for 6 weeks of laundry service. The tin box with the $14 Henry savings from the last timber contract he'd worked before the accident, she left untouched until the first week of September, when she used $9.30 of it to buy pine pitch, a caulking brush, and enough cut nails to frame the outer walls. She had told no one this, not because she was secretive by temperament, but because no one had asked in a way that suggested they actually wanted to know the answer. By the 3rd week of September, the north and west walls of the outer structure were framed and partially planked. Clara worked mornings before the light fully cleared the ridge, stopping only when she needed to oversee what the boys were doing. Owen had her eye. He could look at a joint and see whether it was square without measuring a gift he didn't know yet was unusual. Seth worked hard but needed watching. He tended to rush and then hide the results of rushing. Clara let him make the small mistakes and corrected the large ones without commentary, which was the only pedagogy she knew. The insulation was what gave Harlan Briggs the most material to work with when he held court outside the trading post. By the 4th week of September, Clara had begun stuffing the gap between the walls, the 18-inch pocket of space she had designed and built deliberately with dried moss pulled from the creek bank, compacted straw from the summer's hay supply, and the wool batting from the Reverend's wife's unfinished quilts. She packed it in layers, pressing each layer firm, before adding the next, working with a flat piece of board as a tamper. The effect from outside to anyone who happened to look at the gap before she planked it over was of a wall that was growing a thick, soft interior insulation in a form that was 2 decades ahead of any name Wyoming Territory had for it. Roy Sutter was standing at the trading post counter when Harlan came in from his observations one afternoon in late September and described what he'd seen. Sutter listened, then set down his coffee cup, and his face arranged itself into the particular expression men wear when they've decided something is beneath serious consideration. He said, "She's packing her own tomb." That night, Clara heard the phrase secondhand through Seth, who had been within earshot of the trading post that afternoon. She didn't ask him how he felt about it. She put a fresh piece of birch in the stove and told him to finish his supper. The death of Henry Whitmore on the 4th of January, 1869, was officially a matter of bad luck and worse weather. The facts, as they were generally known, were these: Henry had gone out in a snowstorm to cut kindling from the stand of cottonwood along the creek. A branch had come down, struck him through the hip, and he had bled out trying to crawl back to the cabin. Clara had found him in the last light. His tracks half covered the blood trail plain in the white. where the wind hadn't reached it yet. She buried him beneath the oak tree behind the house in ground. She had to thaw with fire before she could dig it, and she did not weep at the service, not because she didn't feel the weight of it, but because she had learned early in life that grief performed for an audience was a different thing from grief properly held, and she had always been particular about the difference. What was not generally known, and what Clara had not told to another living soul in 2 winters, was what she had seen in the direction of the Briggs homestead that afternoon. She had been at the south window when the branch came down. She didn't hear the impact, the wind was too loud, but she saw through the gap in the cottonwoods along the creek the shape of Henry drop. She saw him try to rise. She saw him fall again. And in the direction of the Briggs place, which sat on the eastern rise and commanded a clear line of sight to the creek stand, she saw the smoke from Harlan's chimney rising in a steady, unbroken column throughout the hour and a half between the moment Henry fell and the moment Clara reached him herself. Harlan had never looked directly at her about it. He had offered the standard condolences at the burial, hat in hand, face carefully neutral, and she had accepted them with the same neutrality. There was nothing to be proved. She had not seen him at the window. She could not say with certainty what he had observed or not observed, and even if she had known with absolute certainty, the social mathematics of the Valley in 1869 did not have a formula for a woman to hold a man accountable for failing to walk into a storm. What she came away with was not rage. Rage required a belief that the situation could have been otherwise, that people were capable of more than they demonstrated. Clara did not have that belief. What she had instead was information in a storm no one comes. Not because people are evil, because they are cold and afraid, and the distance seems too far, and their own fire is already burning. This was simply the nature of things. The shed was the conclusion that followed from that fact. If no one comes, you must make yourself the kind of person for whom no one needs to come. You must be warm enough, dry enough, prepared enough that the storm finds no entry point. You don't rage against the cold. You refuse to let it find you. She had told this to no one because it did not require telling. It required doing. By the 1st of October, the outer structure wrapped 3 sides of the original cabin, northwest and south. The east side faced the morning sun and was left partially open at the top, a deliberate decision to allow warmth from the eastern exposure to work its way in during the hours when the sun was at the right angle. The corridor between the walls varied from 16 to 20 inches in width, stuffed tight with the insulating layers she had assembled through the summer. The outer planks were sealed at every joint with a mixture of pine pitch and creek clay that she had rendered down herself over 3 evenings, the smell of it filling the cabin with something between turpentine and earth. The roof of the outer structure was the detail that would matter most when the wait came. Clara had extended the roof line outward at 15 degrees, anchoring the new rafters to the original cabin's top plate with iron straps she had bartered for from the Peterson Mill's spare hardware. The slope meant that snow, when it came, would not sit on the junction between old roof and new, but would continue sliding outward, dropping into the yard rather than accumulating at the joint and working its way in through the seam. She had reinforced the eaves with doubled planking because the eaves were where load concentrated when a roof was asked to hold more than it expected. Owen asked her, working next to her on the scaffolding she had rigged from sawmill offcuts, why the angle mattered. She set her hammer down on the plank and drew a line in the air with one finger horizontal and then tilted it. "Snow goes where gravity tells it," she said. "You build the angle, gravity does the rest." Owen thought about this for a moment and then picked up his own hammer, and she recognized in the silence that followed the particular quality of understanding that doesn't need to be confirmed out loud. The chimney was the other problem she had thought through carefully. An open chimney mouth in a heavy snow could be buried and sealed in hours. The pressure of the smoke would force it back down into the cabin, filling the room with carbon until everyone in it went quietly and permanently to sleep. She bent a section of stovepipe she had traded for at the Peterson mill into a simple hooded shape, a curved deflector set over the chimney mouth at an angle that would intercept falling snow and divert it to either side while still allowing the smoke column to rise cleanly through the center. She tested it twice with controlled fires in late September before the first hard frost, adjusting the angle until the draw was clean. The firewood wall was the thing that finally pushed Harlan Briggs from amusement towards something he couldn't quite articulate. Through September and into October, Claire and the boys had been building it along the north face of the outer corridor, the corridor directly opposite the most punishing wind direction. She had been cutting and splitting since July, which was when she had started, because she understood that wood dried from the inside out, and that the drying took time no amount of impatience could compress. Birch cut in 30-inch rounds and split to show the white interior. Oak, heavier and slower burning, split into wedges she stacked with the grain running vertical to allow moisture to escape from the end grain. A portion of cottonwood from the stand along the creek, not as clean burning, but adequate for the shoulder seasons, when the fire needed to be maintained but not pushed. All of it stacked in the north corridor, with the cut faces exposed to the air that circulated between the inner and outer walls, warm enough in that protected channel to continue the drying process even as the outdoor temperatures began to drop. The wall of it, when it was finished in the second week of October, was 6 feet high, 4 feet deep, and ran the full 22-foot length of the north face. It was not merely storage, it was architecture. The mass of the wood, dried dense, stacked tight, added its own thermal inertia to the north wall, absorbing and holding what little heat radiated through from the cabin interior and slowing the intrusion of cold from outside. She had not read this in a book. She had thought it through in the dark, measuring consequence against consequence the way a woman does when the wrong answer means dead children. Sadie Pruitt found her at the trading post on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-October, loading a 50-pound sack of cornmeal into the mule cart. Sadie was 61, had been running the tanning operation along Rock Creek by herself since her husband died in 1863, and had the distinction of being the only person in the valley who said directly what she was thinking without apparent calculation about how it would be received. She looked at Clara for a moment and then said, "You're expecting a siege." Clara got the sack settled in the cart and straightened up, working her hands together to rub the grit from her palms. "No, ma'am." "Then what in God's name are you building?" Clara considered the question without any of the deflection she might have used on someone else. There was something in Sadie's face, the directness of it, the absence of mockery, that made evasion feel like a waste of both their time. "A place where the cold doesn't get in," she said. Sadie's expression shifted to something between skepticism and interest. "You can't stop the cold, girl. Nobody can stop it. You just survive it." Clara looked at the mule for a moment, and when she turned back, her eyes were level and entirely serious. "You can if you keep it outside." Sadie studied her. Then she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more the exhalation of someone who has encountered an idea they're not yet certain what to do with, and walked back toward the tanning shed without another word. But she didn't tell the story the way Harlan told it. When Sadie repeated the exchange, which she did twice in the following week, there was no laughter in her version. Reverend Hose came by on a Thursday in the third week of October with a jar of gooseberry preserves and the expression of a man who has been sent on a mission he didn't entirely design. He was a decent man by the standards available to him, Not unkind, genuinely concerned with the spiritual condition of his congregation, and constitutionally unable to let an irregular situation pass without some form of pastoral intervention. Clara was in the north corridor when she heard the knock. Owen answered it. "She's working," the boy said, which was true and also comprehensive. Clara's voice reached the doorway from the corridor. "Let him speak." So he spoke. He praised her fortitude. He noted the community's admiration for her industry. He circled carefully toward the point which emerged eventually as a concern about prolonged isolation and its effects on both herself and the boys, specifically whether she might benefit from more regular fellowship with the congregation, perhaps Sunday meals with the Coles family, perhaps some arrangement by which the boys spent more time among other children. Clara emerged from the side of the corridor with her gloves stiff with pine pitch, her sleeves damp, her hair damp under her hat brim. She looked at the Reverend with the particular attention she gave to problems that required solving rather than people that required managing. "I've got fellowship," she said. The Reverend's face arranged itself into gentle pastoral puzzlement, where Clara, her eyes moved briefly to Owen standing in the doorway and then to the wall of stacked wood rising behind her. "Right here," the Reverend tried again. He said something about the good book and the importance of community in difficult seasons. Clara let him finish. "Then a wise woman builds her house." She turned back toward the corridor, over her shoulder without turning. "You want to help grab a log, otherwise step back from the door." The jar of preserves was left on the porch. She found it there that evening, moved it inside, and didn't open it. What the Reverend brought back to the congregation was not precisely a report of spiritual crisis. It was something more complicated, the account of a woman who seemed entirely in possession of herself, who showed no signs of the desperate grief or unraveling judgment he had been implicitly sent to evaluate, and who seemed, if anything, more purposeful than anyone he had visited that fall. This troubled him in a way he couldn't precisely articulate because it was difficult to offer pastoral support to someone who didn't appear to need it. The older settlers in the valley, the ones who had arrived before the railroad survey, who had wintered twice before the territory had any real infrastructure to speak of, watched Clara's construction with a different quality of attention. Mabel Forrester, who was 73 and had come west in 1849, watched from her wagon one afternoon when Clara was working on the south face and said nothing to the people around her for a full minute. Then she said, "She knows what's coming. You can feel it in your bones." No one asked her what she meant by that. Some things in certain kinds of communities don't get unpacked. They get left in the air like a weather judgment, absorbed or ignored, depending on the constitution of the person hearing them. October moved toward its end, the way the month always did in Wyoming territory, with the light going orange earlier each afternoon and the temperature at night dropping in increments that felt casual until they weren't. The river had been running low since August, the consequence of a summer that had been dry in a mean, deliberate way, as if the heat had decided to take something personally. The banks along Granger Creek showed dry grass 2 feet above the current waterline. The stones there bleached pale where the spring rush had deposited silt, and then the summer had evaporated it. Clara had noticed the river level in July. She had noticed it again in August and September. The low water meant the ground would not freeze normally. The moisture that typically locked the subsoil before the heavy snows arrived was not there. And without that frozen barrier, spring melt would run on the surface rather than soaking in. She had dug the drainage channels in late October before the ground hardened enough to make the work impossible. 4 channels, each 18 inches deep and 2 feet wide, cut in a pattern that would direct surface water away from the foundation of the outer structure and toward the low stone basin on the eastern edge of the property that had once served as a wildlife watering point. Owen had helped with the digging. Seth had complained about the digging and then done it anyway. The channels looked from the road like the preparations of someone who expected a flood, which was not incorrect. On the 27th of October, the first real wind of the season came down from the north. It was not a storm. It was only a preview, a single sustained gust that ran through the valley for about 40 minutes in the late afternoon, strong enough to lift loose hay from uncovered stacks, strong enough to throw a section of the Peterson Mill's stacked lumber sideways into the yard, strong enough to tear the corner of an unpinned tarp off the Dwyer family's root cellar entrance and send it into the lower pasture. 3 structures in the valley lost some portion of their roofing that afternoon. A chimney in town, one of the older brick ones that had needed repointing since the previous spring, shed 3 feet of its upper section into the yard below. Clara's outer structure did not move. She was inside the corridor working on a joint when the wind hit, and she felt the whole structure shudder once, a single tremor like a large animal setting its feet and then hold. The vibration ran through her palm where it was pressed against the wall, and she stood still for a moment and listened to the wind find the outer planking and run along it looking for entry points, and she heard it find none. The pitch-sealed joints held. The doubled eave boards held. The angled roof directed the pressure outward rather than inward, and after the first shudder, the structure moved no further. Owen, who had been stacking in the north corridor when the gust hit, appeared at the interior door, with his hat blown crooked and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be calm. "That was something," he said. Clara continued working the joint. "It was the beginning of something," she said, "that's all." From the eastern rise, Harlan Briggs had been watching. He had seen the timber blow at the Peterson mill. He had seen the tarp lift off the Dwyer cellar, and he had seen Clara's structure absorb the gust and stand. He didn't say anything about it to the men he usually stood with when he was holding court. He turned from the rise and walked back to his own homestead, and that evening he looked at the walls of his cabin in a different way than he had looked at them before. By the end of October, the outer structure was complete on all 4 faces. The corridor ran entirely around the original cabin, interrupted only by the stone chimney at the rear, which rose through the outer roof through a collar Clara had packed with clay and sealed with pitch. Inside the corridor, the temperature was measurably different from the outside air, perhaps 15 to 20 degrees warmer. During daylight, the difference narrowing but never closing at night. The dry air in the cavity did what dry air does, it insulated. The mass of the firewood wall did what mass does, it stored the warmth and gave it back slowly. The sealed joints did what sealed joints do. They kept the wind from stealing everything that the fire inside worked to create. Clara walked the perimeter of it one evening in the last days of October, pressing her palm flat against the outer planking, in several places feeling the surface cold and the faint warmth behind it, the slight differential that told her the system was doing what she had designed it to do. Owen walked with her 2 steps behind, as he often did when she was checking something, because he had learned that this was when she was most likely to explain things. She stopped at the northwest corner, where the wind typically concentrated when it came down from the ridge at an angle, and pressed her palm flat and held it there for a moment. Owen stopped beside her. "Why that corner?" he said. "Because everything tries to get in at the corners," she said. "That's where walls stop talking to each other." He thought about that in the way he thought about the things she said, seriously, and with the particular patience of someone who understands that some ideas need to be sat with before they mean what they mean. The night sky above the valley was already showing the density of winter stars, the kind that appeared only after the summer humidity was fully gone and the air had dried out completely. Clara stood under them for a moment before going in, looking north along the ridge where the cold was assembling itself into whatever it intended to become. She had no way to know the specific nature of what was coming. She had only the general conviction built from 2 bad winters and 1 terrible loss and 2 years of paying attention to the way the land communicated its intentions to the people willing to read it, that whatever came next would be serious and that seriousness deserved preparation that matched its scale. She went inside, she checked the stove. She added 1 piece of birch to the coals, not because the fire needed it immediately, but because she had a rule with herself about fires that went below a certain temperature in the grate, a rule she had made in the winter of 1869 and had not broken since. Owen was already at the table with the lamp turned down low, working on a piece of arithmetic that the Valley's part-time school required. Seth was on the floor near the stove with a piece of string he was using to make a figure of 8 he had learned from one of the Peterson boys. The smell of the cabin was pine pitch and wood smoke, and the particular smell of iron that a stove develops after years of use. A smell that meant to Clara warmth accounted for and wood properly managed. She sat at the other end of the table from Owen and picked up the length of canvas she was reinforcing along the bottom edge for another barrier she was planning around the tunnel leading to the root cellar. The lamp put out a circle of yellow light that reached both of them. Outside, nothing moved. The stars were very bright. Owen set down his pencil and looked at the lamp for a moment, not at her the way people look at something neutral when they're working up to saying something they're not sure how to say. Then quietly, "I don't remember his face anymore." The needle in Clara's hand continued through the canvas. 1 stitch, then it stopped. She did not look up immediately. She sat very still for a moment, in the way she went still when something had struck at a depth that required a moment to assess. Then she looked at Owen. Not a glance, a full look, the kind she rarely gave because it cost something, and she saw in his face that he had been carrying this for a while and had finally set it down between them on the table, not as an accusation, not as grief performed for her benefit, but as a plain fact that he needed her to know. The lamp flame moved slightly. Somewhere in the wood of the outer structure, a plank contracted with a quiet sound, the way fresh cured pine does in the cold. Clara set the canvas down. She stood cross to the stove and opened the grate door. The coals were fine. The fire had no need of what she was about to give it. She took a piece of birch from the stack beside the stove and placed it carefully on the coals, watching the bark begin to curl. She closed the grate and stood there with her back to Owen for a moment, one hand still on the iron door handle. Then she returned to the table and picked up the canvas and the needle and continued working. Seth had fallen asleep against the wall, the figure of 8 strings still looped around his fingers. The lamp held its circle. The stove held its heat. Outside, the valley was silent in the particular way that late October in Wyoming territory was silent, not peaceful, but waiting. Owen picked up his pencil. He did not ask again. He understood with the instinct of a child who has learned to read his mother's silences the way a sailor reads weather, that this was not a refusal. It was a promise of a different kind, not the answer to the question he had asked, but the demonstration of one. The fire she had just fed that didn't need feeding. The wall she had built before anyone else saw the point of it. The way she set her hand to whatever needed doing and didn't stop until it was done. He bent over his arithmetic. She worked the needle through the canvas. The birch caught slowly the way good dry wood does, without drama, without the hissing of a green log or the quick, exhausted flare of something that hadn't been properly aged. It caught and held, and the warmth it gave was steady and honest, the only kind worth building for. By the 1st of November, the outer structure was sealed against weather on every face, but Clara was not finished. The root cellar concerned her. It lay 20 feet behind the rear wall of the cabin, a dugout room framed with old timbers that Henry had sunk into the hillside in their second year at Granger Creek. It held their stored food, the cured meat, the dried apples, the hard cheese wrapped in cloth, the lard rendered down in August and sealed in crockery. In an ordinary winter, it was accessed daily, a quick trip across the yard in whatever weather presented itself. In the kind of winter Clara was preparing for, a quick trip across 20 feet of open yard in a blizzard was not quick and was possibly fatal. She'd been thinking about the tunnel for weeks. She started it the first week of November before the ground could freeze solid. The work was uncomfortable in a specific way, not dangerous but sustained and physical in the manner that leaves its evidence in the body for days afterward. She dug a trench from the rear corner of the outer corridor to the cellar entrance, 4 feet deep, 4 feet wide, bracing the sides with short planks as she went. Owen worked beside her on the digging. Seth carried the excavated soil in a bucket to the slope behind the cabin, where Clara had decided to build a soil berm as additional wind protection. The work took 9 days. She roofed the trench with planking laid across the width, then covered the planking with the excavated soil tamped back down over it. What remained was a buried passage not tall enough to stand in, fully but wide enough to walk through. Stooped the walls, closed the floor dry. The air inside it warmer than any outdoor air by perhaps 20 degrees, because the earth itself at that depth held the previous summer's warmth. She packed cedar chips along the floor for dryness. She patched 2 places along the roof where the planks didn't quite meet using strips of canvas and more pitch. The entrance from the corridor side she fitted with a low door that latched from the inside with a wooden bar. Owen crouched at the cellar end and called back through the length of it, "It works." 2 words, no embellishment. She had also through October and into November sorted her kindling by size in a way no one who hadn't thought carefully about fire management would have considered necessary. Small cedar slivers, the smallest she could cut cleanly, went into a wooden crate near the stove. The first strike material, the stuff that caught from a spark and burned long enough to nurse the larger pieces into combustion. Medium splits went into a series of feed sacks hung from hooks along the inner corridor wall, protected from any moisture that might work its way through the outer structure during a thaw. The heavy oak pieces, the ones that would provide the long, slow heat through the coldest nights, were stacked in the north corridor with military precision, grain up, bark out, each piece its proper distance from its neighbor, so that air could still move between them. She had built in effect not just a shelter, but a fire system. The shelter protected the fuel. The fuel fed the fire. The fire protected the occupants. Remove any element of that chain and the others failed. She had thought through every point at which the chain could break and had built redundancies. 2 fire starting methods in case one failed. 2 approaches to the cellar in case one was blocked by a collapsed beam. 2 kinds of burn wood for every stage of the fire from kindling to sustained heat. She wrote none of this down. There was no paper to waste on it. It existed in her head in the form of a practiced sequence, the way a surgeon might carry the steps of a procedure, not as a list, but as a motion. Something the hands knew because the mind had rehearsed it until the rehearsal and the doing became one thing. November brought the first dusting of snow, light and dry, the kind that blew off the ridge and settled in the low places without commitment. The valley moved through its annual late autumn rituals, hay under cover. Animals brought in closer to the main buildings, wells checked, and rope lines strung between doorways and outbuildings, so that if a whiteout came, you could navigate from one to the other by feel. These were the preparations everyone made. They were necessary and insufficient, and everyone who made them believed they were sufficient because they had always been sufficient before. Clara watched the preparations with the particular attention of someone who has already concluded that this year was not like the years before. The river was still low. The ground was not freezing the way it should. The wildlife along the creek had moved earlier than usual, the deer gone from the lower brows in September rather than October, as if they too were reading something in the air that the human occupants of the valley were not yet reading. She said none of this to anyone because there was no framework in the valley for receiving it. A woman telling her neighbors that she believed the coming winter would be serious beyond their preparations was a woman who would be told that she was frightened, that grief had affected her judgment, that she needed fellowship and perspective. She had no interest in that conversation. She went back to her work. By mid-November, the tunnel was finished and the cellar fully stocked. She had the firewood wall in the north corridor. She had the sorted kindling. She had the reinforced chimney cap. She had the drainage channels. She had the sealed joints and the doubled eaves and the angled roof. She had in the food stores in the cellar enough dried and cured food to sustain 3 people for 12 weeks if they were careful, 14 if they were very careful. She allowed herself on the evening of the day she completed the final inventory of the cellar to sit by the stove for 20 minutes without working. Owen found her there when he came in from the evening check on the mule. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her because it was unusual and because he understood, as children of particular parents do, that the unusual thing deserved attention. She was not sleeping. She was not reading. There was nothing to read. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and her face held the expression of someone who has finished a thing they were not entirely sure they could finish. He came in and closed the door quietly and hung his coat on the peg and went to the stove and held his hands out to it. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. Then he said, "Is it enough?" She looked at the stove. She looked at the walls. She looked at the low ceiling of the cabin and thought about the outer structure around it and the tunnel behind it and the cellar at the end of the tunnel. "It has to be," she said. He understood this was not evasion. It was precision. There was no such thing as certainty about a winter that hadn't arrived yet. What there was preparation sufficient to meet the worst thing you could honestly imagine, and then a little more on top of that for the things imagination failed to reach. Seth came in half a minute later with snow on his hat brim, reporting that the mule was settled and the water in the trough was already skimming at the edges. Clara stood smoothing her apron with both hands and went to start supper. The lamp was lit. The stove was doing its work. The structure around them held the night outside where the night belonged. What Harlan Briggs did in the second week of November, he did at dawn before the valley was properly awake. He had been watching through October and into November with the specific attention of a man who is unwilling to admit he is watching and who therefore never quite manages to learn what he is watching carefully enough to understand it. He had the general shape of what Clara was doing, the outer walls, the packed corridor, the firewood stored inside, but he did not have the details because the details were in the specifics of how she had built and why, and those specifics were not visible from a distance. He built a version of it on the north face of his own cabin. He did this with green timber he cut himself that week, timber that had not had a season to dry and would contract and split in the cold. He nailed the planks without chinking the gaps because from a distance it hadn't been apparent to him that Clara's gaps were sealed. He stacked his firewood in the corridor directly on the bare earth because he had not seen her platform of split logs that she used to keep the bottom course off the soil. He built it in 4 days, which was faster than he had expected, and when he was done, he stood back and looked at it and felt satisfied in a way that had more to do with having done something than with having done it correctly. There were men in the valley who might have told him the gaps mattered. There were men who had watched Clara carefully enough to know about the sealed joints. But no one said anything to Harlan, partly because telling Harlan Briggs he was doing something wrong required a specific kind of patience and a specific tolerance for what came back at you, and partly because no one was entirely certain yet that Clara's approach was correct and Harlan's was wrong. The winter hadn't arrived yet to adjudicate. The temperature on the night of November 28th dropped to -14 degrees Fahrenheit. Not a storm, just the clear cold that comes when the clouds that insulate the ground disappear, and the heat bleeds straight up into a sky that offers nothing back. Clara woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the cabin settling and added wood to the stove without lighting a lamp, navigating the familiar space by the faint orange glow from the grate. The outer structure held the temperature inside the corridor at something she estimated at 10 to 12 degrees above outside air. Not warm, but 10 degrees above -14 was enough to mean that the firewood stored there remained well above freezing, dry, unfrozen, ready. In the corridor the next morning, she pressed her palm against the wood of the north firewood wall and felt what she had built it to hold. Not warmth exactly, potential. The stored quiet potential of dry wood waiting to become heat, the most patient form of energy available to a woman with a stove and a winter ahead of her. December arrived with the flat gray sky that Clara had learned to read in 2 winters as the sky of something preparing itself. Not the dramatic buildup of a frontal system with its advanced clouds and rising wind. The other kind, the still kind, the kind that laid a lid over the valley and let pressure build beneath it for days before releasing what it had assembled. She spent the first 3 days of December on final checks. Every joint in the outer structure, every section of the chimney hood, the latch on the tunnel entrance, the inventory in the cellar counted again by hand, the kindling crates full to the lip, the ox rope strung from the cabin's rear door to the tunnel entrance, so that in a true whiteout she could find the tunnel by feel without getting turned around in 10 feet of open yard. On the morning of the 4th, she came out of the cabin before full light and stood in the yard with her arm raised, testing the air. The air was still, absolutely still, the kind of still that wasn't peace but pressure. The mule in the lean shed at the east end of the property stood with its ears in a position that meant it was paying attention to something it didn't understand. Seth came out behind her and stood at her elbow and looked at the ridge the way he sometimes did when something was different, but he couldn't identify what. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly and steered him back inside. "Today we stay in," she said. He didn't ask why. He was his mother's son enough to know that when she said a thing like that in a voice like that, the explanation was in the saying of it, not in what followed it. Owen was at the stove when they came back in. He had already, without being asked, brought in 2 armloads of wood from the corridor and stacked them beside the grate. He looked at his mother's face when she came through the door and looked at the stove and back at her face and went to get 2 more armloads. Clara checked the chimney hood from inside the corridor, looking up at the flue exit through the roof collar. Draw was clean. The hood was positioned correctly. She went through the kindling crates one more time, not because she expected to find anything wrong, but because checking things was how she made peace with uncertainty. You checked what could be checked and accepted what couldn't, and the checking was itself a form of preparation, a way of telling yourself that you had done what was in your power to do. The snow began that night. It came without wind, which was the thing that should have warned people and didn't, because people expected blizzards to announce themselves with wind. Instead, it fell straight down in a dense, soundless curtain, and the temperature when it began was 31 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree above freezing. The snow was wet. It packed immediately wherever it landed, dense and heavy, soaking into anything porous on contact. Clara was awake. She stood at the narrow gap in the boarded window and watched the first hour of it come down. Watching the way it behaved and what she saw confirmed the things she had been preparing for since July. The snow landing on the outer roof of the outer structure slid off the angled surface almost immediately, too wet to grip, tumbling into the yard in heavy clumps. The snow landing on the firewood wall in the corridor where the roof protected it left it untouched. The snow landing on every other structure in the valley landed and stayed and soaked, and was already doing its quiet damage before anyone inside those structures understood what kind of storm they were in. She turned from the window and went to the stove and opened the grate and put in a piece of birch, then a piece of oak on top of it, letting the birch get started before the oak closed over it. She adjusted the damper to its winter position, 2/3 closed enough draw to keep the fire clean, but not enough to let it burn too hot and waste wood it would take hours to replace. Owen was asleep. Seth was asleep. The stove was fed and the chimney was drawing and the tunnel was latched and the cellar was stocked and the firewood was dry. She had done everything that was in her power to do. What came next would be what it was. She sat in the chair nearest the stove and folded her hands in her lap and listened to the snow come down against the outer planking, a sound like someone dragging a cloth slowly and without urgency across a surface that had no intention of yielding. The cold outside was assembling itself. Inside the stove kept its steady measure, and the walls held everything they were asked to hold. The storm's first 12 hours were the deception. That was the thing Clara had understood before anyone else in the valley understood it, standing at the boarded window in the pre-dawn of December 5th while the snow came down at 31 degrees, and the people in every other cabin along Granger Creek looked out at the same falling white and made the same calculation. Light snow warm enough, no real wind yet. Time to get more wood in before it turns. Time to check the animals. Time to do the dozen outdoor tasks that had been deferred through November on the assumption there was still margin left. They went out. That was the fatal thing. They went out into air that felt mild by December standards, and they moved their wood and tended their animals and checked their cellars and did all the reasonable things, and while they did them, the snow soaked into everything. It touched the outer layers of stacked cordwood, the canvas tarps stretched over winter stores, the burlap around the base of stacked hay, the edges of every door seal that wasn't perfectly tight. And then between 10 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon of December 5th, the temperature dropped 33 degrees in 3 hours. Clara was in the corridor making the fourth of her scheduled checks on the outer structure's joints when she felt the temperature change. Not heard it, felt it, a shift in the quality of the air against her exposed wrists, a tightening as if the air itself were contracting around whatever heat remained in it. She stood still for a moment with her hand pressed against the outer planking and felt the planking go from merely cold to something harder and more committed. And she went back inside and told Owen to bring in everything that remained in the yard. There was nothing remaining in the yard. She had moved it all inside the corridor in October. Owen understood what she was actually saying, that the decision she had made in October had just been validated in a way that would not feel like vindication to anyone it had failed to protect. He went to the inner window and looked at what could be seen of the valley through the narrow gap she had left between planks, just a strip of white and gray, the near edge of the Briggs property visible on the far rise, and he saw the smoke from Harlan's chimney. It was thin, thinner than it should have been at 10 in the morning on a day like this. By noon, the smoke from the Briggs chimney had stopped. Not diminished. Stopped. The column simply ceased as cleanly as if someone had extinguished a candle, and the sky above the eastern rise showed nothing but flat gray cloud and the beginning of the wind that the storm had been withholding for its second movement. Clara saw it. She noted it the way she noted everything as data, without the overlay of emotion that data didn't require. Harlan Briggs's fire was out. His wood, whatever he had stored in his improperly built outer structure, had been soaked through in the 12 hours when the temperature had been just above freezing and the wet snow had found every unsealed gap in his planking. The wood he had stored directly on earth had drawn moisture from below through the night. The green timber of his outer walls had already begun to torque in the rapid temperature drop, opening the joints further rather than closing them. His structure had failed him in exactly the sequence his choices had made inevitable. She added a piece of oak to the stove. The wind arrived in the afternoon of December 5th from the northwest, not as a gust, but as a sustained pressure that leaned against the outer structure the way a body might lean against a door. It was trying to open through patience rather than force. Clara heard it first as a low resonance in the outer planking, the planks vibrating at a frequency just below the range of a sound you could name, and then as a voice that found the narrow gap at the top of the roof collar where the chimney exited and made itself heard, there a thin, persistent note that rose and fell with the wind's variations. The fire held. The draw was clean. The hood she had bent and mounted over the chimney mouth did what she had tested it to do, intercepted the snow driving nearly horizontal by late afternoon, and split it to either side while the smoke column continued to rise, bent now by the wind, but unbroken, carrying the evidence of her fire up into the storm for anyone who might be looking for it. Owen fed the stove at the scheduled intervals she had established before the storm began. Every 2 hours, the size of the addition calibrated to the current temperature outside, as she estimated it from the behavior of the fire and the feel of the corridor air. Everything in the north corridor rang clean when two pieces knocked together, the sound of properly seasoned wood dry all the way through. Seth's job was the vents. Every 2 hours opposite Owen's wood feeding schedule, he went to the stove's air intake at the base and checked that the slot hadn't been blocked by ash accumulation inside or by snow working its way under the outer door. It was a 10-minute job, careful and specific, and he did it without being reminded after the first day, which told Clara something about her younger son that she had suspected but not yet confirmed, that he rose to the level of the stakes. He needed to understand that something mattered before he gave it his full attention, and in the first hours of the storm, the stakes had become unmistakable even to a 10-year-old. The first night was the calibration. Clara didn't sleep through it. She allowed herself intervals of rest, sitting in the chair by the stove with her eyes closed, her hands folded. Her breathing slowed, but she returned to full attention every hour and a half, rising to check the quarter joints, the chimney draw, the wind's behavior against the outer structure, the temperature differential between the cabin interior and the corridor air. The corridor was holding at somewhere between 12 and 15 degrees warmer than the outside air, she estimated, at somewhere below 0 Fahrenheit by midnight. The cabin interior held at 44 degrees, cold enough to see your breath if you moved away from the stove, warm enough that the boys slept without waking. The storm outside was doing what heavy storms do to a valley, erasing it. The fences went first, buried to their top rails by 3 in the morning. The road through the valley center, such as it was, had already become indistinguishable from the surrounding land. Individual structures were still visible as shapes against the white, but their defining details, the lines of their construction, the angles of their roof lines, were softening under accumulation. By morning, the valley would look like something seen through gauze, the familiar landmarks still present, but muffled their outlines, suggesting rather than asserting what they were. The outer roof of Clara's structure shed its load continuously, the angled surface doing exactly what the angle was designed to do. Every 20 minutes or so, she heard the sound of accumulated snow releasing from the slope and falling into the yard, a soft, heavy sound like someone setting down a burden, carefully rather than dropping it. and each time she heard it, she noted that the roof was not being asked to hold what it wasn't designed to hold. On the far rise, the shape of the Briggs homestead was already beginning to lose its outline. By the morning of December 6th, the storm had been running for 36 hours and had established itself not as a passing system, but as a settled condition. Clara had expected this. The pressure she had felt in the air on the morning of the 4th, the stillness that wasn't peace, the sky that was a lid rather than a ceiling, had told her this was not a storm with a timeline it was willing to share. It had arrived, and it intended to remain for as long as it needed to remain, and the only appropriate response to that intention was to have prepared for it without an expiration date in mind. The valley outside was 4 feet deep in places, deeper in the low draws where the wind had moved snow from the exposed ridges and deposited it in the sheltered flats. The main road was under 5 feet along the stretch nearest the trading post. The Dwyer homestead, visible from Clara's south-facing window slot, had shed half its main roof overhang. Overnight, the weight had found the weak point in the older structure and pressed until something gave, and now a section of the east eave hung at an angle that suggested the remainder would follow. She didn't know yet whether anyone was hurt in the Dwyer place. She couldn't know. The distance between their properties was not great in summer, but in this storm it was absolute. On the morning of the 6th, Owen brought in the first morning load of wood from the corridor without being asked and without ceremony, and Clara noticed that he had arranged the pieces in the order we would have arranged them herself, smallest on top, largest at the bottom, the birch segregated to the left where it was easiest to reach for a quick fire start. She didn't remark on it. Remarking on it would have been a kind of condescension, the suggestion that getting things right required acknowledgement rather than being simply the expected standard. The second day brought no relief and no change in the storm's character. If anything, the snow intensified through the afternoon, the flakes smaller and drier now as the temperature continued its descent, the wind more variable than it had been on the first day, shifting direction in unpredictable increments that tested different faces of the outer structure in rotation. The northwest face held. The southwest face held the double planking, absorbing the lateral pressure without flexing. The east face, which caught the morning sun in clear weather and had been the least insulated of the four because it faced the warmest exposure, showed the lowest quarter temperature of any side, perhaps only 10 degrees above outside air, but it held. In the cabin, the boys had developed a rhythm with each other that didn't require coordination, because it had been established by their mother's example and had become in 2 days simply the way things were done. Owen fed the stove. Seth checked the vents. They split the task of maintaining the narrow viewing gaps in the boarded windows, wiping condensation from the inner surface of the glass every few hours so that the view of the outside remained available. They ate what Clara prepared in the portions she set in front of them without comment. When there was nothing immediate to do, Owen worked on his arithmetic and Seth slept, both of which were reasonable uses of time and energy in a situation that rewarded conservation of both. Clara worked. She always worked. When the structure's maintenance demands were met, she turned to the smaller preparations that extended the system's capacity, reinforcing the tunnel door's latch with an additional length of rope tied through a drilled hole, building a small platform inside the tunnel entrance from scrap planks so that items retrieved from the cellar could be set down without touching the frozen ground, sorting through the kindling crates one more time to ensure that the smallest material was on top and accessible without digging. She moved through these tasks with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed them so many times in imagination that the physical execution felt like a formality. On the evening of the 6th, she inventoried the cellar by lantern light, moving through the low space with her hand trailing along the shelves Henry had built into the earthen walls. The crocks of lard were intact, sealed tight. The dried apples in their muslin bags were dry and smelled of the summer they had been picked in. The cured side of pork hanging from the ceiling hook was firm and properly cold, cold enough to preserve, not cold enough to freeze solid and become difficult to work with. She counted the day's worth of each item against the number of people she was provisioning and came to the same calculation she had done in October: 12 weeks, if careful, 14 if very careful. She was provisioning 3 people. She knew this number would not hold. The second knock in her mental inventory, the one she didn't perform out loud because performing it out loud would have required an explanation she wasn't ready to give, was the calculation she had been running since the storm's second day. How many people in this valley had fires right now? And how many of those fires would still be burning by day 5? She set the lantern on the cellar shelf and stood in the low room for a moment with her hand on a crock of lard, doing the arithmetic not of food but of wood and warmth, and the specific choices that had been made or not made through September and October and November. The Briggs fire was already out. The Dwyer roof had begun to go. The trading post at the valley center, she had no information on it, but the building was old and the chimney had been pointed by Elias Gruber, who was not particular about the quality of his mortar. The Forrester cabin on the South Ridge was well built, but old Mabel was alone and had no one to manage a fire through the night if she went to sleep. The arithmetic came out the same way each time she ran it. She picked up the lantern and went back through the tunnel to the cabin. The night of December 7th into December 8th was when the beam cracked. She heard it at 2:17 in the morning. She knew the time because she had been awake and watching the shadows on the wall from the stove's glow, doing the mental accounting she did when she couldn't fully rest. The sound was not a crack in the sense of something breaking suddenly. It was more deliberate than that, more considered a long, slow groan from the outer corridor's western face, the specific complaint of wood underload that has been patient for a long time and is beginning to exhaust that patience. She was in the corridor before the sound had fully finished. The western rafter, the long beam she had set to carry the outer roof across the full width of the cabin's west face, had developed a split along its grain, starting at the point where she had notched it to accept the ridge board. The notch had been cut correctly, but the beam itself, which she had selected from the Peterson Mills offcuts, had a hidden check in the grain, a small internal crack that the drying process had opened further over the weeks since installation, and which the weight of accumulated snow on the roof above it had now persuaded to express itself structurally. The split ran 18 inches down the grain and was still opening incrementally under the steady pressure of the load above. She stood in the dark of the corridor with her hand on the beam and felt the vibration in it, the live vibration of something still moving, still in the process of failing, and calculated what she had available and what she needed to do and in what order. Because order mattered, and there was no one to think this through with her, and no time to wish there were. She needed the 2 wedge-shaped pieces of scrap pine she had stored at the east end of the corridor against exactly this kind of contingency, though she had hoped the contingency would not arise. The length of hemp rope from the hook inside the cellar tunnel door. The mallet, not the hammer. The hammer would drive a wedge too fast and risk splitting the beam further. The mallet would coax it. She needed to work without a lamp because both hands would be required, and she had no third hand for the lamp, and she could not afford the time it would take to rig a holder. She got the wedges and the rope and the mallet and went back to the beam in darkness. The work was tactile. She had done similar work in daylight on other structures in other seasons, and her hands carried the knowledge her eyes couldn't use. She ran her palm along the split to gauge its width and direction, feeling the grain the way you feel a seam in cloth, following it, not fighting it. The wedge went in at the upper end of the split thin end, first positioned across the grain to arrest the opening rather than drive into it. She coaxed it with the mallet in short, measured strokes, feeling for the moment when the wood's resistance shifted from accepting the wedge to being held by it. The beam shuddered once when the wedge seated. Snow fell from the roof above. She heard it release and drop into the yard outside, and the roof above the corridor shifted its weight fractionally as the load redistributed. She held still with both hands flat against the beam until the movement stopped. Then she added the second wedge 6 inches below the first, same angle, same coaxing strokes. The rope went around both wedges in a figure 8 that pulled them against each other and against the grain of the beam, binding the repair in the way a splint binds a break, not restoring full strength, but providing enough lateral support to carry the load until the storm passed and proper repair could be made. She tied it off against the beam with a knot Henry had shown her in their second year at Granger Creek, a knot she had never used for this purpose, but which held in every application she had tested it in. The beam was quiet. She stood in the dark corridor for a full minute with her hands still on the timber, feeling for any resumption of the live vibration that had brought her out here. Nothing moved. The snow outside pressed on the roof, and the roof pressed on the beam, and the beam held the wedges and the rope, and communicated none of that force downward in any new way. It was not a permanent solution. It was a solution that would last as long as it needed to last, which was all any solution was required to do. She went back inside. Owen was sitting up on his bedroll with his eyes tracking her across the room. He had heard her moving, though not the work outside, and had been awake waiting in the way he waited for things quietly and without assumption about what the outcome would be. She crossed to the stove and added a piece of birch because the fire had dropped while she was in the corridor. Owen looked at her, the dark patches on her shoulders where snow from the roof had fallen, the rope burns across both palms, visible even in the stove's dim light, the particular set of her jaw that meant the problem had been encountered and dealt with and was now behind her. He didn't ask what had happened. He understood that if she'd needed his help, she would have woken him. The fact that she hadn't was the information. She pulled her chair to the stove and sat with her palms open toward the heat and let the warmth move back into her hands. Seth slept through all of it, which was exactly what she would have chosen for him if the choice had been hers to make. In the morning, she said nothing about the beam. She checked it twice through the day, and the repair held. She did not add it to the mental catalog of things that needed to be explained or acknowledged. She added it to the catalog of things that had been handled. The knock came on the evening of the 4th day. It was faint, that was the first thing, not a knock in the assertive sense, but in the sense of a person who has arrived at a door with whatever strength remains to them after the distance they have traveled to reach it. Clara was in the corridor at that moment, performing the evening check on the outer joints, and she heard it through the planking as a sound that didn't fit the grammar of wind and snow and structural settling. It was irregular, it was human. She moved to the outer door, the door she had built into the north face of the corridor, the entry point to the outer structure, and she undid the bar and opened it. The cold came in around Sadie Pruitt, or what remained of Sadie Pruitt, after an hour and a half in that storm. One boot was gone. Clara could not imagine the sequence of events that resulted in a woman arriving at a door with one boot gone, and she did not ask. The hair at Sadie's temples had frozen into a gray-white mass pressed against the skin. Her right hand extended toward the door frame, had fingers so rigid they didn't move when Clara took hold of the wrist. Her left hand cradled her right forearm against her body, the way someone holds something fragile that they understand might shatter. Clara pulled her in by the wrist. She didn't speak, and Sadie didn't speak. Speech required a resource that Sadie was not currently in a position to spend. Inside the corridor, Clara stripped the frozen outer coat from her. The coat had gone stiff as board and got her moving through the inner door into the cabin's warmth. Seth, startled awake, scrambled to his feet and looked at the shape of the woman coming through the door with the particular alarm of a child confronted with something that doesn't match any category his experience has prepared him for. Owen was already up, already moving toward the stove with a pot for water. Clara got Sadie onto the floor near the stove with a wool blanket around her shoulders and a second one over her legs and the bootless foot, and waited with her through the first 10 minutes while the warmth began its work, the painful work, the kind that announces itself in the fingers and toes with a sensation like being cut with something thin and cold. The body's circulatory system reopening channels, it had begun to shut down in the interest of survival. Sadie's face went through several expressions during those 10 minutes, none of which were comfortable, and she made sounds that weren't words, and Clara held the blanket steady around her and didn't look away from her face because the face told her what she needed to know about how the recovery was progressing. When Owen had the water hot enough, he poured it into the tin cup with a measure of the molasses Clara used for cooking, and Clara put it in Sadie's hands. The rigid fingers had softened enough to close around it barely, and held her own hands around the outside of Sadie's hands until the cup's heat transferred through all 4 sets of fingers. Eventually, Sadie found enough function to speak. The tanning operations stove had cracked 2 days ago, a hairline fracture in the firebox that she hadn't noticed until the smoke began finding the crack, instead of the flue backing into the room in slow, invisible increments. She had made it through the first night by burning everything she had that was already cut and dried, keeping the fire very small to reduce the pressure in the damaged firebox. On the second night, she had run out of small wood and put in a larger piece, and the pressure had forced the crack further open, and the smoke had filled the room in earnest. She had gotten out. She had walked 1 mile and 2/10 between the tanning operation and Clara's cabin in a storm that had been running for 90 hours, navigating by the slope of the ground under her feet and by the occasional visibility of the ridgeline when the snow briefly thinned. She had lost the boot in a drift she had stepped into in the dark, and she had made the decision that stopping to retrieve it was not a decision she could afford. Clara listened to all of this without interrupting. When Sadie finished, she took the empty cup and refilled it with plain hot water and put it back in her hands. Sadie looked at the stove, at the walls of the cabin, at the corridor doorway behind her, where the warmth from outside the cabin was still minimal, but the wind was entirely absent, and she said, her voice steadier now, "I saw your smoke, all the way from the last ridge before the creek crossing." That was all she said about it, but it was enough to confirm what Clara had already understood: the chimney hood and the fire management and the 2 days of constant attention she and the boys had given to keeping the burn clean and steady had produced something visible at distance in a storm. The smoke had been a signal she hadn't deliberately sent, but which had traveled where it needed to travel. On the 5th day, 3 more people arrived. They didn't come together. They came in sequence through the afternoon and early evening, each one finding the cabin by some combination of the smoke column and the luck of having started in the right direction. The first was a man named Cutter, who ran a small cattle operation on the valley's northwest edge, and who arrived with both hands wrapped in strips of his own shirt, the improvised bandaging explained by a fire he had tried to rebuild from almost dead coals the previous night using lamp oil, the result of which had been a flash that took the hair from his forearms and left the palms of both hands in a state that required more than anything Clara had available. She cleaned the burns with water and wrapped them in clean cloth from the cedar chest, and told him to keep his hands elevated above his heart, which he did with the focused compliance of a man in too much pain to argue about anything. The second and third arrived together, a mother from the valley's south edge, carrying a child of perhaps 3 on her back in a manner that had kept the child alive, but had exposed the woman herself to cold in every direction. The child was semi-conscious, cold to the touch, below the knees, but breathing regularly. Clara stripped the child's lower clothing and held the small feet between her palms until the circulation demonstrated itself in the return of color and sensation, using the 10-minute interval to assess whether frostbite had progressed to tissue damage. It had not. She wrapped the feet in wool and put the child near the stove in the position that maximized warming without overheating, which was a more precise calculation than it sounded. By the end of the 5th day, there were 7 people in the cabin and the corridor. The corridor became sleeping space for those with the greatest cold tolerance. Owen, without being asked, moved his bedroll to the outer corridor, the warmest section of it closest to the cabin wall, and slept there that night without complaint, which freed his space inside for the mother with the child. Seth stayed inside, positioned near the stove, on the grounds that he was 10, and frostbite was a different proposition on a 10-year-old than on a fully grown person. The internal tensions of living with 6 strangers in a space designed for 3 were not dramatic. They were granular, specific, the kind of friction that accumulates between people who have nothing in common except the necessity of sharing warmth in a confined space. The man Cutter was accustomed to making decisions, and he twice offered opinions about fire management that were both incorrect and delivered with the confidence of someone who expected them to be received as useful. Clara heard them both out fully and then continued doing what she had been doing, which communicated everything that needed to be communicated without requiring a confrontation that would have consumed energy nobody could spare. The mother with the child wanted the fire larger. She asked twice. Clara looked at her the second time, a measured look, not unkind but level, and said, "The wood we burn now is the wood we won't have in a week." The woman pressed her lips together and didn't ask again. Later that evening, Clara brought her a second blanket from the cedar chest, not as a concession, but as a practical adjustment. If the fire couldn't be larger, the insulation around the child could be. On the 6th day, Reverend Coles arrived. He came alone, which was a fact Clara noted because it told her something about conditions at his homestead that she would need to account for. He was in better condition than any of the previous arrivals he had prepared after his fashion, and his fire had lasted into the 6th day before the green wood he had stocked. The previous fall began producing more hiss than heat, and the chimney developed a buildup of creosote from the incomplete combustion, and he had made the judgment, which was the correct judgment, that the chimney was approaching a condition where it would become a fire risk of its own. His right hand had a burn on it, a chemical burn from a fire-starting compound he had tried when the regular wood refused to catch, and he arrived holding it against his coat with a kind of careful stillness that meant it hurt considerably more than his face was admitting. Clara cleaned it and wrapped it with the same cloth she'd used on Cutter's hands, working quickly and without unnecessary handling. He looked around the cabin at the people arranged across its floor, at the cleared stack of wood beside the stove, at the systematic order in which everything was maintained, and he was quiet for a long moment, in the way that men who are accustomed to occupying moral authority go quiet when they encounter a situation where that authority has no purchase. He had come with his jar of gooseberry preserves to this woman's door in October. He had suggested she needed fellowship. He was now standing in the only warm room in a valley where people had been walking through a blizzard to reach a fire that a woman he had tried to redirect toward greater sociability had been building since September. Clara looked at his hand and then at his face and said, "You'll move wood from the south wall, stack it back the same way after you pull, every gap filled." He moved wood. By the 8th day, there were 14 people in the cabin, and the outer corridor distributed in a hierarchy of warmth that Clara had organized. Practically the most vulnerable, the child and elderly woman named Mabel Garrett, who had walked in on the 7th day with her boots frozen to the shape of her feet, and Cutter with his burned hands closest to the stove. The others, in layers outward from that center of heat, calibrated to their insulation and their need. The corridor served as the outer ring occupied by those with the most cold tolerance and the clearest sense that the arrangement was temporary and required nothing beyond endurance. The food was the constraint that required the most arithmetic. Clara measured by the ladle, not the bowl, because the bowl implied abundance, and abundance was not what they had. She had 14 days of food for 3 people in the cellar, which meant run forward through the mathematics of 14 people, an unknown duration, something less generous than she would have preferred. She made no announcement about this. She simply served what she served and trusted that no one was hungry enough to mistake her measures for stinginess rather than calculation. On the 8th evening, she inventoried the North Corridor's firewood wall for the first time since the storm began. She had been burning from it daily, pulling from the accessible outer face and working inward, and the wall had diminished from its original depth of 4 feet to something closer to 3 feet at its thinnest section. She counted the remaining cords, not precisely because precision wasn't possible in the dark with a lantern and other people moving through the corridor, but with enough accuracy to determine that the supply was adequate. Adequate for 2 weeks. Adequate for what this storm could plausibly demand. Adequate, if it came to it, for what storms sometimes demanded beyond what was plausible. She put the lantern back on its hook and stood in the corridor in the silence between the outer planking and the inner log wall, feeling the particular quality of the air. There, drier than outside, warmer than outside, carrying the faint cedar and pine smell of seasoned wood in a closed space, and she took a long breath of it. The storm outside offered nothing back. The snow was still falling, still piling, still testing every seam and surface it could reach. 3 walls held it. The roof above shed it. The beam she had splinted on the 3rd night held its repair without complaint. The fire inside burned clean and steady at the intervals Owen maintained without being asked. On the 9th night, one of the people in the corridor, a young man named Thomas Garrett, Mabel's grandson, who had come in behind her on the 7th day, came to the inner door and knocked quietly and said his grandmother was not responding normally to her name. Clara went out and found Mabel Garrett in the state of blunted consciousness that sometimes overtook very old people in extreme cold. Not unconscious, but turned inward, the awareness running at a low frequency, the body conserving what it needed to conserve. Clara moved her fully inside to the floor nearest the stove and sat beside her for 2 hours monitoring, and the old woman's consciousness gradually surfaced back to full operation like something rising slowly through deep water. And by midnight, she was asking in a perfectly coherent voice whether there was any coffee. There was not any coffee. There was hot water with molasses, which she accepted with the dignity of someone who had lived 73 years and understood that the available thing was preferable to the unavailable thing. On the 10th day, the wind began to change. It didn't stop. It didn't diminish markedly, but it shifted its direction in a way that Clara, who had been reading wind in Wyoming territory for 6 years, recognized as a sign that the storm's axis was rotating. The pressure that had been leaning on the northwest face of the outer structure for 9 days began arriving with slightly different emphasis, and the sounds the outer planking made shifted half a register in pitch. Not louder, not softer, but different. The way a piece of music changes quality when it moves from one key to another. She noted this to herself and told no one. That evening, she went into the North Corridor alone and walked its length, pressing her palm against the firewood wall at intervals, feeling the dry solidity of what was left. The storm had taken 9 days of burning. The wall still had what it needed to have. She stood at the far end of the corridor in the dark and listened to the wind run along the outer planking and find nothing it could use. And the sound of it, the futile, patient, indifferent sound of weather encountering preparation, was not triumphant to her and was not even satisfying in any warm sense. It was simply the result of the only thing she had ever found worth doing, looking at the worst thing she could honestly imagine and building against it until the building was sufficient. Owen appeared in the corridor doorway behind her, holding the lamp low. He had heard her moving and followed the way he always followed when something was happening that he thought he should know about. In the lamplight, his face had the quality of someone who has been older than his age for long enough that the oldness had become simply who he was, rather than something imposed on him by circumstances. He looked at the remaining wall of wood and then at his mother standing at the end of it, with her hands still flat against the stack. His voice in the corridor was quiet, measured, the voice of someone who has learned that the corridor's acoustics carry sound in unexpected ways. "Are we enough?" She held her hand against the wood for another moment. The firewood was dry. The beam overhead was holding. The people behind them in the cabin were cold and uncomfortable and frightened and alive. Outside, the wind was changing direction for the first time in 10 days. "Enough," she said. One word. He took it and went back to the fire, and she heard him at a piece of birch, exactly what the fire wanted at that moment, nothing more. And the sound of the wood settling into the coals was the sound of something that had been built correctly working. The wind changed for good on the morning of December 14th. Not gently. It didn't soften and then stop the way a wind sometimes does when a system has exhausted itself. It shifted, a hard pivot from northwest to northeast that arrived in the early hours as a change in the note. The outer planking made a rising pitch that peaked and then settled into something lower and less sustained, and Clara, who had been in the state between sleep and attention for the better part of 10 days, felt a change in the way she felt temperature differentials and structural stress as information arriving through the body before the mind had finished processing it. She was upright before she fully understood why, standing in the cold center of the cabin, with her hand raised slightly, listening. The outer structure was quiet in a new way. Not the silence of weather relenting. The weather had not relented, but the silence of weather that had changed its angle and was now striking surfaces it had not been striking before, and finding them adequate in ways it was disinclined to acknowledge. She went to the corridor and walked its length, pressing against the northeast planking and then the southeast, reading through her palms the difference between 10 days of sustained pressure from one direction and the first hours of a new angle. The joints were holding. The beam she had splinted 8 days ago held its repair without any indication of new movement. The roof above the northeast section shed its first load of reoriented snowfall into the yard with a sound she felt as much as heard, a soft compressive release, like a long breath finally taken. She went back inside and added wood to the stove and let the rest of the cabin sleep. By the morning of December 15th, the storm had been running for 11 days, and the valley was as thoroughly buried as Clara had ever seen anything buried. She knew this not from having gone outside. She hadn't opened the outer corridor door since the last arrival 4 days prior, but from the information the building itself provided, the changed quality of the light filtering through the narrow window gaps, which had gone from gray to white as the accumulated snow rose above the window levels on the north and west faces. The altered acoustic character of the exterior, sounds arriving from outside with a muffled underwater quality that indicated significant depth between the source and the ear. The way the outer door had begun to resist opening in the evenings, the snow piling against it from outside until she had to push with her shoulder to crack the latch. The tunnel was what she had designed it for. The root cellar end remained fully accessible, the entrance protected by the hillside overhang she had reinforced with planking. She and Owen had been making the cellar run once daily, retrieving what was needed and returning through the low passage without exposure to anything above ground. The platform she had built inside the tunnel entrance, the small slab of scrap planking she had added in November so that items brought from the cellar could be set down without contact with the frozen ground, had proven its usefulness in the simple way that practical things always prove themselves, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the daily accumulation of small frictions it prevented. On the morning of the 15th, she decided it was time to go out. The decision was not spontaneous. She'd been calculating it for 2 days, assembling the variables the way she assembled a fire, the right pieces in the right order, each one positioned to support what came next. The wind had changed and was diminishing. The snow had stopped adding to itself in any meaningful way. The outer door's resistance had stabilized overnight, which meant the drift against it had stopped growing. And there was a more urgent reason she needed to see what the valley looked like, because what the valley looked like would tell her what the coming weeks would require. And she needed that information before the needs it generated became emergencies rather than preparations. She and Owen dug together. He worked the outer door while she cleared behind it, the two of them alternating pressure and excavation in the tight space of the outer corridor, shoveling the compacted snow that had found its way into the entrance gap, backward into the corridor where it could melt gradually rather than being fought all at once. The work took an hour and a half. Owen's arms gave out twice and he shook them out and resumed without comment. Clara's shoulders ached in the specific way that sustained overhead work produces a burning in the trapezoids that she noted and worked through. When the outer door finally opened fully, the light that came in was extraordinary, white and absolute, the light of a landscape that has been reduced to a single color and is only beginning to understand that other colors once existed. She stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping up because the snow surface was above the threshold level and she needed to test whether it would hold her weight before she committed to it. It held crusted hard by the overnight freeze, firm enough to stand on without snowshoes. She stepped up and out and turned slowly, and what she saw produced in her something that was not grief and was not relief exactly, and was not the satisfaction of having been correct. It was closer to the feeling of confirmation, the sensation of having prepared for something and then seeing with complete clarity the exact scale of the thing you prepared for. The valley was gone, not destroyed. The land was still there beneath it, the creek still moving somewhere under the white, the structures still standing in their places or not standing, as the case proved. But the valley as a legible landscape, as a place with visible edges and features and the evidence of human habitation distributed across it in recognizable form, that was gone. What remained was a white expanse broken only by the angles of roof lines where roof lines still held their angles, and the scattered thin suggestions of smoke from the 3 or 4 structures that had maintained fire, and the occasional dark protrusion of a chimney or a ridgepole catching what light there was. The Dwyer homestead, visible from where she stood on the crusted surface of the yard, had lost not just its overhang, but most of its east-facing roof. The weight of 11 days had pressed on the weakened joint she had seen beginning to fail on the second morning, and at some point in the intervening days, the joint had finished what it started, and now the east face of the Dwyer cabin sat open to the sky like a broken box. She saw no smoke from it and no movement. The Briggs homestead on the eastern rise was a shape under snow. The lopsided structure of Harlan's improperly built outer shell had collapsed entirely. At some point, she couldn't tell when from what she was looking at, because the snow had smoothed over the failure the way it smoothed over everything, erasing the evidence of specific moments in a general white that made all failures simultaneous. What was left was the outline of the main cabin, still standing, but dark, no smoke, no light through any gap. Behind her, the vent in the outer roof collar exhaled its steady column of dark smoke, climbing straight up through still air into a sky that was beginning at its eastern edge to show the first pale suggestion of blue it had shown in 11 days. Owen stood beside her, having come up through the door behind her. He looked at the valley for a long moment without speaking, cataloging it with the particular thoroughness of someone who understands that what he is seeing will be the basis for decisions made over the weeks ahead. When he spoke, his voice was level, the voice of his mother's son. How many didn't make it? Clara looked at the thin smoke lines distributed across the white four of them, maybe 5 at distance. She looked at the dark structures showing no smoke. She counted silently running through the valley's population, the way she ran through the cellar inventory by name and location and last known condition. She didn't answer Owen's question directly because the honest answer was that she didn't yet know, and she wouldn't know until the snow gave up its information, and the snow would do that on its own schedule without reference to what she needed from it. She looked at him instead. "Get Sadie, we need the south wall cleared." He went. She stood on the crust a moment longer, looking at the valley that had buried itself, and then she stepped back down into the corridor and closed the outer door and went to the stove and added 2 pieces of oak because the day ahead was going to require more than birch could sustain. The next 3 days were the difficult quiet after the storm, the period that people who survived the storm itself sometimes found more demoralizing than the storm, because the storm had a clear enemy and a clear task, and the period after it had neither. The snow wasn't falling, but it wasn't leaving. It sat on every surface with the settled permanence of something that has decided its business in this place is concluded. The drifts along the north face of the outer structure were level with the top of the window shutters. The yard was a featureless expanse of crust, broken only by the channel Clara had dug on the first morning, out a narrow trench leading from the outer door to the edge of the property, where the drainage channels began. Inside, the 14 people who remained in the cabin and the corridor had settled into the particular state of extended emergency habitation, something that was not comfort and was not crisis, but existed in the pragmatic space between them. The tasks were distributed and were performed. The food was measured and was consumed. The fire was maintained and the wood was replaced at the intervals Clara had established. No one was warm enough. No one was in immediate danger. These 2 facts occupied the same space without contradiction, and the people who had spent 11 days in Clara's cabin had by this point learned to live inside that particular contradiction without requiring it to resolve in one direction or the other. On the 17th of December, Evan Briggs came. He came in the mid-morning, appearing at the outer door with his coat stiff and his face stripped raw by the cold and his trouser legs wet to mid-thigh from the drifts between the Briggs homestead and Clara's property. He had found the trench she had cut from the outer door and followed it to the entrance, which was the most coherent navigational decision available in a landscape that had erased all other landmarks. When she opened the outer door and found him standing in the trench, he looked at her with the eyes of someone who has expended everything he had in the getting to a place and is running solely on the fact of having arrived. He told her the main cabin had held barely but the firewood he and his father had stored both in Harlan's failed outer structure, which had collapsed on the 4th day, and in the secondary stack they had kept against the south wall of the cabin, had been soaked through in the storm's first 12 hours and had never properly dried afterward. They had been burning wet wood for a week, which meant incomplete combustion, which meant creosote accumulation in the flue, which meant the chimney was now a fire risk, and they had reduced the fire to almost nothing to manage it, and almost nothing was not enough. His father was in the cabin in the state of someone who had been cold for too long, in a way that had moved past ordinary cold discomfort into something more systemic and concerning. Clara listened to all of this. Then birch grove east of the property line. Peel the bark. Dry bark catches clean, even when the wood below it is compromised. Take what you need, bring rope and bundle it in small amounts. Evan looked at her with something complex in his face, gratitude and shame in a proportion that made neither one clean, and his voice when it came was barely above the register of normal speech. We don't deserve your help. Clara looked at him steadily. The wind outside moved across the crust with a dry, papery sound. Burn it clean, she said. That's enough. He went. She watched him cross the yard in the trench and then climb the drift at the property line and drop down the other side, and she closed the outer door and went back to the stove and adjusted the damper, the fractional amount that the morning's temperature required. The question of Roy Sutter's body came 4 days later. The snow was beginning to relinquish its grip on the valley surface, not quickly, not graciously, but with the incremental reluctance of something that has been in possession of a place and is being displaced by a warmth it regards as seasonal and temporary. The crust softened in the late morning and refroze each night, but softer than the night before, and in the places where the drainage channels had done their work, the surface had begun to show the dark underlayer of soil beneath the snow as the melt found its channels and moved according to the geography she had given it. Evan Briggs was working in the birch grove on the 21st of December when he found the body. He came back to Clara's outer door that afternoon with his face arranged in the specific stillness that people adopt when they have encountered something that requires a particular quality of communication, not urgency exactly and not detachment, but a careful control of delivery that acknowledges the weight of what is being transferred. He told her where he had found the man. He described the position face down, oriented toward the south in the direction of Clara's property. He described what the man's right hand held, a matchbox. The cardboard kind sold at the trading post for 1.50 cents per box containing 40 matches. The box had been in the snow for somewhere between 8 and 14 days, which was enough time for the cardboard to have softened to a pulp that had then refrozen solid around the contents. Every match inside was soaked through before it froze. The striking surface on the box's side had dissolved entirely in the wet before the cold had come to preserve what remained. He hadn't lit a single one. Clara stood in the doorway of the outer corridor with her hand on the doorframe and looked at Evan's face while he finished speaking, and she was quiet for a long moment after he finished. She knew who it was before he said the name, because the direction and the distance and the date all assembled into an answer that was only one person. Roy Sutter had left his own cabin in the storm. She could reconstruct the logic of it, the wood gone wet, the fire failing, the decision made in desperation to move toward wherever the smoke was coming from, which was the only navigation available. He had made it to the birch grove. He had tried to start a fire there with what he had. He had not had anything that could catch. Evan said the name. Clara's face did not change in any visible way. She looked past him for a moment at the white expanse of the yard, at the drainage channels running their small, dark lines across the surface of the snow, at the thin afternoon light coming flat and without warmth across the ridge. The man had stood at the trading post in October with his hand pointing directly at her and laughter in his voice, uncertainty in his posture. The certainty of someone who has never been wrong in a way that cost him anything real, and so does not understand that the cost of being wrong about certain things is absolute and arrives without warning and leaves no opportunity for revision. She looked at Evan. Take him to high ground. Find a place where the melt won't reach him. Dry ground if there's any left on the ridge. Evan started to say something else. She could see him beginning to formulate it, some words about justice or irony or the specific cruelty of the ending, and she looked at him with a steadiness that wasn't cold but that communicated with complete clarity that she had no use for the words he was assembling. He stopped. He nodded once and left. She went inside and stood by the stove for a moment with her hands open to the heat, and she thought about a man who had a matchbox in his pocket and couldn't use it, and a woman who had built a structure around an existing structure starting in September and had not needed a matchbox since the first frost. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel the particular satisfaction that people in stories feel when the person who dismissed them encounters the consequences of their dismissal. What she felt was the specific sadness of waste, the waste of a life that had been ended by a gap between what the man believed about winter and what winter actually was. He had believed, as most of them had believed, that the winter you survived last year was the measure of the winter you needed to prepare for. He had been wrong by the specific margin that killed him. She added a piece of birch to the stove and went to check on Mabel Garrett, who was asking again about coffee. The melt, when it came in earnest in the first week of January, was not the gentle release that the word implied. Snow on that scale melting across a valley floor whose subsoil was not frozen in the normal way because the summer drought had left it dry before the winter arrived, produced not a gradual return of visibility, but a surge of surface water that had nowhere to go except along the easiest available gradient. The creeks ran first, which was normal. Then the low points between properties flooded, which was not normal. Then the fields along the valley floor became something between pasture and pond, the soil unable to absorb what the surface was sending down because the frozen layer beneath it acted as a barrier, and the water ran on top of the ground the way it runs on pavement. Clara's drainage channels performed their function with the straightforward reliability of things built correctly for the purpose they were built for. The water that ran off the outer structure's roof and walls found the channels and followed them to the low stone basin on the eastern edge of the property, which filled and then overflowed in a controlled direction away from both the cabin and the outer structure's foundation. The tunnel showed no seepage. The root cellar set into the hillside at an elevation that put it above the flood line stayed dry. The rest of the valley was not organized in this way, and the rest of the valley paid for it. The Dwyer family's root cellar, already compromised by the roof collapse, flooded to a depth of 3 feet, taking with it the stored food that represented their ability to survive the second half of winter without depending entirely on what could be obtained from town. The stores were a loss. The cured meat floated, the root vegetables waterlogged, and began to rot. The grain sacks absorbed so much water that they split their seams and surrendered their contents to the flood in a slow, unstoppable dissolution. 3 other cellars flooded in varying degrees. One family on the valley's south edge found that the melt had worked its way under the cabin floor through a gap they hadn't known existed, and had come up through the floorboards as if the earth itself were trying to reclaim the space. They arrived at Clara's outer door on the 8th of January, 4 of them standing in the trench she had not yet filled in because she had suspected correctly that it would continue to see use. She let them in. She gave them what she had to give, which was heat and measurement in the specific directions that the situation required. She was running lower on food than she had been running in December. The cellar had been depleted by 6 weeks of feeding people who had arrived with nothing but. She was not yet at the point where the arithmetic became impossible, and she had learned through December that the arithmetic never became impossible if you managed it in time and didn't wait for it to manage you. By the 12th of January, by her own count, 22 people had passed through the cabin at some point since the storm began. Not all at once, the population had shifted through the weeks, people arriving, and then as conditions outside marginally improved, returning to their own properties to assess the damage and begin the work of recovery. Some stayed longer. Mabel Garrett stayed until the 20th when her grandson Thomas came to collect her on a horse that had been retrieved from somewhere in a set of circumstances Clara didn't inquire into. Sadie Pruitt stayed until the second week of January, by which point she had become so useful in the distribution of food and the management of the room's general logistics that Clara had stopped thinking of her as a guest and started thinking of her as a second set of hands with good judgment, which was rarer than either of them acknowledged out loud. The Reverend left on the 5th of January, returning to his own family with a quality of humility in his going that was genuine and noticeable without being performed. At the door of the outer corridor, he turned back and started to say something. Clara was already looking at the south wood wall, calculating the remaining supply with her eyes the way she had calculated it with her hands in December. He closed what he had started to say and left, and the quality of his leaving told her something about what the winter had taught him that he hadn't been able to learn from the outside. Harlan Briggs came on the 15th of January. He came alone in the mid-morning, and he stood outside the fence line in the snow that had consolidated to a firm pack, but not quite disappeared, and he waited. He did not knock on the outer door. He did not call out. He stood at the fence and waited, and Clara, who saw him from the viewing gap in the south corridor, let him wait for 4 minutes before she went out. She crossed the yard to the fence line. They were separated by perhaps 8 feet of packed snow and the remains of a fence that had spent most of December invisible beneath the accumulation. He looked older than he had looked in October, not dramatically, not in a way that could be precisely named, but in the way that a difficult winter ages the people it doesn't kill, adding something to the weight of the face that isn't there before. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her for a long moment. The sky above the valley was a clean, pale blue, the first real blue since the storm's last day. And the light in it had the sharp, clarifying quality that Wyoming Territory sky gets in January, when the moisture has been wrung out of the air completely. He looked at her in that light and said, "I was wrong." Clara looked back at him. The wind moved a small amount of surface snow across the yard between them and dispersed it against the fence boards. She was not feeling what she might have felt about this moment if she had spent any of the last 2 years wanting it. She had not wanted it. She had not wanted anything from Harlan Briggs except for him not to be in her way. And since he had never actually been in her way, he had only talked while she worked. And talking while someone works is not the same as obstructing them. She found that she had no strong feeling about his presence at her fence in the middle of January. She said, "Your boy did good work in the birch grove." Harlan looked at her. Something moved in his face, a rearrangement of elements around a center that was shifting and then settled. He nodded once, a single motion, and turned and walked back along the route he had come, his footprints in the snow, precise and deliberate, the walk of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is not in any hurry to arrive. Clara stood at the fence for a moment after he had gone, watching his figure diminish across the valley floor. Then she turned and went back to the cabin. There was wood to restack in the south corridor, where the pull-down had left gaps that needed filling, and gaps in a wood wall, even a wall that was no longer the primary defensive perimeter it had been in December, were still gaps, and gaps were the things that cold found. The work of January and into February was different from the work of December in the way that Reconstruction differs from survival. Survival has a clear metric: you either do or you don't. Reconstruction has no clean finish line. It has only the daily diminishment of the distance between where things are and where things need to be, and the capacity of that distance to expand again at any point when circumstances decide to expand it. Clara had no illusions about this. She had built her outer structure not as a single winter's response, but as a permanent feature of the property, understanding that the specific winter that had just passed was unlikely to be the last winter of its kind in her lifetime or her children's lifetimes, and that the lesson of building for one specific event, rather than for the general reality of winter in Wyoming Territory, was the lesson that Roy Sutter had died to teach and that she intended not to need taught twice. She spent February reinforcing the beams she had splinted in December properly this time, with seasoned timber and iron strapping, the kind of repair that would last 2 decades rather than the emergency version that had lasted 10 days. Owen helped her with the installation, holding the new timber in place while she drove the bolts, and she noted that he had developed enough upper body strength through the winter's work to hold the timber steady without instruction. A physical fact that registered alongside the other facts about her elder son, that the winter had made visible his judgment about fire management, his reading of the corridor's temperature differentials, his understanding of when to act and when to wait. That was beyond what could reasonably be expected from a 12-year-old boy, and that Clara attributed not to any exceptional quality of his intelligence, but to the specific education of having been responsible for something that mattered. The valley rebuilt itself through February and into March with the industrious, slightly desperate energy that follows catastrophic winters in places where people have chosen to stay. The choosing to stay was not insignificant. Several families did not stay. 3 properties went dark through the late winter, and their owners did not return in spring, having made somewhere in the long calculation of January the decision that the valley had asked too much and would continue to ask too much, and that the asking would eventually collect what they were not willing to give. Clara noted their absence without judgment. The calculation was personal, and the answer was different for different people, and she had spent 2 years building a life that did not require anyone else to validate its terms. What rose across the valley through the spring were the shells. They called them Whitmore shells, which was not a name Clara had suggested or encouraged or acknowledged publicly in any way. It had simply arrived the way names for things arrive in communities, when the thing needs a name and the thing has a clear origin, and it spread with the same organic reliability that useful ideas spread in places where survival is not abstract. By April, there were 6 of them in visible stages of construction. By May, there were 11. They varied considerably in quality, which was inevitable given that the people building them were working from observation rather than instruction, reconstructing from the outside in what Clara had designed from the inside out. Some were too loose, the planking not sealed adequately at the joints. Some were built with timber that hadn't been given enough time to season. Several had the angle of the secondary roof slightly wrong, insufficient to shed the snow that the correct angle would have sent sliding. But they were built, and imperfect preparation that was built was incomparably better than perfect preparation that was only planned, which was a distinction Clara had understood for 2 years, and which the valley was now slowly and through the specific tuition of consequences beginning to understand as well. She didn't offer corrections. When someone asked her directly, she answered directly, as she had always done, with the minimum of words required to convey the necessary information. She did not run a school, and she did not issue proclamations, and she did not accept the position of authority that the winter's events had in the valley's collective understanding conferred on her. Because authority was a position that required energy, she was not willing to spend on being acknowledged rather than on the work itself. Sadie Pruitt came by in April once the roads had cleared enough to make the trip from Rock Creek straight forward. She brought coffee, real coffee, ground the kind that had been unavailable through the winter, and Clara put water on the stove, and they sat at the table in the cabin that smelled now of cedar and pitch and the particular layered warmth of a space that had held too many people through too cold a winter and was still in some atmospheric sense giving that warmth back. Sadie looked at the outer corridor, visible through the open inner door, and at the firewood wall along its north face replenished now to full depth by a month of cutting and splitting in the improving weather. She looked at the patch on the west rafter visible from where she sat, the new timber, pale against the aged wood beside it. She held her cup in both hands, the hands that had arrived frozen in December and had recovered with no permanent damage, and she said, "How did you know it would be that bad?" Clara poured her own cup and sat across from her. "I didn't," she said. "I built like I couldn't afford to find out." Sadie looked at her for a moment and then looked at her coffee, and they sat together in the comfortable way of people who have been through something that doesn't require revisiting, who can share a table in the evidence of what they survived without needing to narrate it. The summer of 1872 was kinder than the summer of 1871. The rains came at the right intervals, and the river ran at its proper height, and the hay was full, and the animals gained back what they had lost through the hard months. Clara cut and split wood from July, as she had always cut and split from July, because July was when you started, if you intended to be ready, and readiness was not a state you achieved once and held. It was a practice, continuous, requiring the same daily attention as the fire that embodied it. Owen 13 by July had become something she was careful not to identify too precisely, because identifying it would have made it smaller than it was. He was becoming himself, not a version of her, and not a version of Henry, and not a compromise between them, but a person who was assembling himself out of the materials available to him, which included 2 winters of serious consequence, and a mother who had never once told him that things were fine when they were not, or that the world was arranged more generously than it was. This was not a comfortable upbringing. Clara did not believe that comfort was the primary obligation of a parent to a child. She believed the obligation was fitness to fit the child for the world as the world actually was, which required showing them the world as it actually was, rather than as one wished it to be. Seth had grown 2 inches since December and was in the summer of 1872, becoming someone who was going to be different from his brother in ways that were already visible, and that Clara found in the private arithmetic of parenthood equally valuable for being different. Where Owen was deliberate and economical, Seth was fast and intuitive, making correct decisions by a kind of rapid pattern recognition that had no patience for the careful sequential logic Owen preferred. They complemented each other in work the way a pry bar and a hammer complement each other, not the same tool, not interchangeable, but accomplishing together what neither accomplished alone. The October of 1872 arrived with the cold that Clara had been reading since August, a different cold from the previous years, less extreme, less invested in catastrophe. She had been reading the summer's rains and the fall's precipitation and the river level and the behavior of the wildlife along the creek, and none of what she read indicated a repetition of what 1871 had been. This did not cause her to build less or prepare less or treat the coming winter with less seriousness. She built the same. She prepared the same. She treated winter the same way she had always treated it, as a thing that was coming, regardless of what the preceding months had suggested, about its intentions because winter did not adjust its behavior to match what the previous summer had implied it would do. On a morning in the last week of October, the air carrying the dry scent of coming frost and the ridge already showing the first overnight snow at its highest elevations, Clara was in the outer corridor checking the south planking's caulking. The pine pitch contracted in the cold and needed attention at the seams each fall when Owen appeared in the inner doorway and said without particular emphasis that she might want to look toward the eastern rise. She set down the caulking brush and came to the south-facing gap in the corridor wall and looked. Harlan Briggs was on the eastern rise in the location where he had stood the previous October, with his jug of whiskey and his commentary. He was not standing in the same way. He was bent forward with a hammer in his hand, driving a nail into a length of planking that he had propped against the wall of his cabin, and he was doing it with the slow, methodical effort of someone who has not done this kind of work before and is learning the resistance of the material as he goes. His son Evan was not with him. He was alone. The planking was rough and the angle was not quite right, and from where Clara stood, she could see that the joint where his new board met the existing wall was going to need caulking before it was weatherproof. But the hammer was going, the nail was going in. She watched him for a moment. The morning light came sideways across the valley the way it had come on the morning of the previous September, when she had driven her first nail into the first plank of the outer structure's first wall. It caught the fresh wood the same way it had caught hers, the resin in the cut surface picking up the light and holding it briefly as the board was pressed against the wall. She turned from the gap and picked up the caulking brush and returned to the seam she had been working on. Owen waited. He was very good at waiting, had always been good at it, in the specific way of people who understand that the space between an observation and a response is not emptiness, but information. After a moment, he said, "Aren't you going to say anything?" Clara worked the brush along the seam, pressing the pitch into the joint and smoothing it with the flat of the handle. The seam took the pitch evenly, which meant the wood beneath it had dried through the summer the way it was supposed to dry and had not developed the surface irregularities that poor drying produced. She said nothing for a long enough time that Owen might have thought she wasn't going to answer at all. Then, "He already knows what I'd say." Owen looked at her for a moment and then went back inside. She heard him add a piece of wood to the stove. It didn't need it at that hour, which was a reasonable thing to do with your hands when you were thinking about something. The afternoon turned cooler as the sun moved behind the ridge. Seth came out and asked if the caulking on the east face needed checking, and she told him it did and sent him to it with the brush and a fresh pot of pitch. She checked his work an hour later and found it adequate, which was a word she used the way others used excellent, because adequate work done consistently was the only thing that held against the things that winter brought. At dusk, she stood in the outer doorway and looked at what the fall had assembled around her. The firewood wall to her left was full, 6 feet high and 4 feet deep, the cut faces pale in the failing light, the grain running vertical, the way she had always stacked it. The corridor was sealed, the rafter overhead bearing its repaired timber with the quiet solidity of something that had been tested and had held. The tunnel was latched. The cellar was stocked. The mule was settled for the night. Owen appeared at her shoulder. He leaned against the door frame and looked with her at the valley going dark, the thin smoke from the valley's cabins rising in the still air, more smoke than last October. The smoke of more fires. Better fires that had been thought about in September and started from wood that had been cut in July. He said, "Seth wants to know if we have enough for winter." The evening star appeared above the eastern ridge, the first visible star, arriving in the narrow band of dark blue that spread above the horizon before the full dark came. Clara watched it settle and hold. She said, "Tell him we have what we built. We always have what we built." Owen went inside and she heard him carry those words to his brother, and she heard Seth receive them in the particular silence of someone turning an answer over until it opens. She stayed in the doorway a moment longer. On the eastern rise, in the last of the fading light, Harlan Briggs's hammer was still moving. Slow, patient, one nail at a time. Clara closed the outer door and set the bar. The night came fully. On both sides of the valley, for the first time, fires were being tended by people who had learned what fires cost and what they required and what happened in the dark when they went out. That knowledge had not come cheap. It had come the only way such knowledge ever came, and it would hold through the winters ahead in the walls people had built, in the wood they had stored, and the children they had taught to listen for the sound a beam makes before it fails. She went inside to where the stove burned clean, and her two sons sat at the table with the lamp between them, one at his arithmetic, the other turning a figure of 8 in a piece of string he'd been practicing since December. And the smell of the cabin was wood and heat and the particular combination of materials that meant the cold was outside and everyone inside was accounted for. She banked the fire for the night, each step the same as every night before it, and went to bed. The walls stood. The morning would find everything in its place.